Greetings. Welcome to our 53rd episode of the FGI podcast series. My name is Tim Stark, and I'm a professor of civil engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and technical director of the FGI. On today's episode, we are going to focus on our April 11, 2024 webinar titled Best Practices for Geomembrane Penetration and Attachment Details. I'd like to quickly reintroduce our speakers. First is Pat Elliott. He is the Director of Installation Services at Colorado Lining International, which is a ViaFlex company. Pat and his team are active in the International Association of Geosynthetics Installers, IAGI, and the FGI. Pat is the current president of the FGI. So Pat, thanks for doing that. And Pat has over 25 years of experience installing geosynthetics. Okay, next speaker is Ron Frobel. He is a registered professional engineer and owner/principal of RK Frobel and Associates Consulting Engineers. Ron has more than 30 years of experience in the field of geosynthetics. He has worked on design, application, testing, installation, forensics, and development of geosynthetic materials. And our third speaker today is Matt Kemnitz. He is the president of Leak Location Services, Inc., which has surveyed over 500 million square feet of geomembrane at almost 4,000 project sites around the globe, ranging in size from 1 to over 200 acres. Okay, Pat, Ron, and Matt, thanks so much for joining us again. We have questions left over from the live webinar, and we have a number of questions that were submitted in the follow-up survey after your webinar. So let me start with the questions from the live webinar. And the first one is for Pat. Pat, for attachments to curved concrete walls, what type of batten bar do you recommend?
Yeah, so quickly, I recommend aluminum, typically aluminum bar if it's a curved wall. But not to create more questions, we have used many different types of attachment just depending on the application. You know, we've even used rigid HDPE sheet with holes punched in it, and depending on the curvature of the wall, you can still use a stainless steel, you know, the 1/4 inch by 2 inch standard bar. So it just really depends on the, you know, how tight the curve is. If it's a round, like a manhole structure, something like that, we've even resulted in going to the bandit clamp like a large pipe boot. So it really depends on the curvature, but aluminum is usually the best option for that.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Second question is for Matt Kemnitz. Matt, how would you recommend covering SS bands prior to testing?
Okay, good question. So for these stainless steel bands, the best kind of cover we would use would be like a mastic tape, something real thick to cover over that band, really get a good seal. It's not going to get 100% blocked out any kind of leakage or any water getting into that band, but it is going to greatly reduce it, which is going to help the survey. Now, again, you don't need anything to cover those bands if you're doing a bare liner test. If it's covered with water, though, yeah, it would definitely help the survey and increase the sensitivity.
Okay. Next question. This is for Ron Frobel. Ron, can you describe what the water stop is that is between the pipe and the concrete collar?
Yes, the water stop is usually a prefabricated tape or material such as Sikaflex Hydrotype, which is attached to the pipe and will swell when water attaches to it. So you wrap it around the pipe, maybe two wraps, two different locations where the concrete will come to the pipe, and keep it about 2 inches in from the end of the concrete, from the edge of the concrete into the pipe. So Sikaflex makes one. There's also a material called swell tape, and these materials are hydrophilic. They will swell when water hits them, so it provides a good water stop.
Okay, so that completes the questions that we did not answer during the live webinar. So now I want to turn to the questions that we received after the webinar in the follow-up survey. Question number 1 for Pat. Without a prefab boot, would there not be a lot of wrinkles in the penetration to have to seal?
Yeah, I think in short, no. Field fabricated boots can have a tendency to fit tighter because you're working on the actual boot, on the actual pipe as you're building it. It's just like prefab boots are great. I use them a lot. It's just critical that the prefabricated boot the measurements are correct. The outside diameter of the pipe, the slope ratio, and just depending on the application, sometimes that can vary in the field compared to what what the information you receive as the fabricator. So in short, no. Typically you can build the boot, but I do obviously I like building boots in the factory whenever possible.
Okay. Number 2, and Pat, this is also for you. Have you used an HDPE plate welded to an HDPE pipe and fabricated to the slope to attach a geomembrane instead of a pipe boot?
So I've never done it as a pipe, but we have done HDPE rigid sheet sumps and attached, the membrane to that, or you can even do that with LLDPE or even some PVCs. You got to make sure that the membrane is compatible with welding to the rigid sheet. I haven't done it with a boot, but I have done it with sumps. So I'm assuming there would be no difference in that.
Okay. Number 3, and this is for Matt. Matt, how close can you leak test adjacent to an embedment strip?
For an embedment strip, you can get with a spark tester, you can get about an inch away to that embedment strip. You just don't want to touch those bolts or anything that's going to earth ground. Same thing with the water puddle or bare liner method. You just got to keep the water off. So if you can control that water, you can get within an inch away.
Great. Okay. Number 4, Pat, this is for you, and it's a fairly long question. So, is there a method for constructing boot seals in the field that reduces the potential for leak around the location of where the pipe protrusion meets the flat surface?
Yeah. So in short, no. It really, the problem is to get that to lay intimately against the subgrade around. You don't want a lot of folding, a lot of wrinkling. I have seen some boots where people try to do that. The problem is you get a lot of bunching in those corners, and now you've got too much material there that can stress or stretch or pull on those welds or move. So it's really better to get that laying against that subgrade, or if it's a concrete collar, laying against that as intimately as possible to reduce any stress on those welds. But ultimately you can spark test on both sides of those on that underneath weld and that top weld. So in theory you should be able to 100% test that weld. So it's really not a matter of folding, it's more of just a matter of being diligent with your testing.
Okay, great. Number 5 is for Ron Frobel. Ron, what's a complete spec for all trades to understand how to best install the embedment strips to satisfy both inspectors and installers?
I don't think there's a complete spec on this. What we have is manufacturers' recommendations and drawings from the various manufacturers for the size of the embedment strip and how to place it. So, I don't think there's a complete spec on that.
Okay. And let's see. Last question from the follow-up survey is for Pat. Pat, what criteria are used to determine the size of the skirt?
Yeah, so it's very there's not a lot of criteria. I mean, other than you want to overlap any hole is typically industry standard, like even in a patch, 6 inches. So you go 6 inches beyond where the cut liner is. Sometimes you need to make that skirt a little bigger to, get your welding equipment in there. So it just depends on the method of how you're welding that skirt to the primary membrane, on how much space you need. And then there's times when you've got tight construction of other pipes that has a tendency to make those skirts smaller, or you're attaching skirt to skirt between two pipes to eliminate weld. So you want to go as big as possible, or as big as needed to complete the weld properly, but you also want to reduce that. You don't want extra welding. There's no point in extra hand welding. So that's kind of up to the installer. So there's not really a predetermined sizing, but that's kind of the rule of thumb that we use as an installer.
Okay. So that is all of the questions from the webinar and after the webinar. So thanks to Pat, Ron, and Matt for an excellent webinar and answering these outstanding questions. If you have any additional questions or would like additional information, please send your questions to the FGI at fabricatedgeomembrane@gmail.com. And you can download the webinar slides and this podcast from the FGI website in the webinar library. So Pat, Ron, and Matt, thanks again.
Thank you.